Hi, this is Wendy. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I will be explaining how to crochet a gauge swatch, what information you can get from your gauge swatch, and how you can use that information to your advantage when following a pattern or creating your own design. Finally, I'll give some suggestions for how to make adjustments if the gauge doesn't meet the requirements. To make a gauge swatch, patterns generally specify gauge as so many stitches and rows per 4 inches or 10 centimeters. But your gauge swatch should be larger than that so that you can measure away from any distortion at the edges. For example, you might find that your foundation row pulls in a little bit, and that's going to skew your measurements. So make a gauge swatch that's at least 6 inches square. 10 inches is even better, and just use your most comfortable normal tension when you're making it. So how to measure for gauge. I have got pins in my swatch here, and I actually put one at 4 and one at 8 inches so I can double check to make sure that my number is correct. In this case, this is a crossed double crochet with a row of single crochets in between. So I've marked the row of single crochets. If you have a fancy pattern, it can be a little tricky to find where to put your pins, but put them where you can see the stitches clearly. And when I count the stitches in between my markers here, between the 0 and the 4 inches, I find I have 16 stitches. So that's my gauge for my sample here, 16 stitches. And then as far as the rows, I would measure in this direction. Again, my swatch is about 8 inches wide, so I'm going to measure somewhere in the middle here. And I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 rows. Okay, so 16 stitches and 12 rows. That's how you measure your gauge. So how can you use that information? If you're not using a pattern, you're just coming up with your own design, a gauge swatch can help you plan your project. First of all, you can extrapolate from your swatch to decide how many stitches you need for your project. For example, if my swatch has 16 stitches in 4 inches, and I would like my blanket to be 40 inches wide, I can do the math with that information. So 40 inches divided by those 4-inch increments, of course, is 10. And I'm going to multiply that by the 16 stitches I have in 4 inches. So I know that I need 160 stitches to get a 40-inch wide blanket. Okay? So I need to do those 16 stitches 10 times to get 40 inches wide. You can also figure out from your swatch how much yarn you're going to need for the full project. Maybe you say, well, I don't really care if it comes out a little bigger or smaller, but I want to make sure that I'm not going to run out of yarn partway through, and that's a real nuisance. So what you'll need is a kitchen scale like this. I've got mine set up to grams here. I take the pins out, and I'm going to weigh it. It is 47 grams. All right, what does that tell me? Well, if I measure this whole thing, actually I'm going to write that down for a second, 47 grams in my sample. And if my sample is 12 inches by 8 inches, give or take, pretty close. So 12 by 8 is 96. So I have 96 square inches in my sample. So 47 grams gets me 96 inches squared. Okay, if I want my blanket to be 30 inches by 40 inches. That's 1,200 square inches. For my finished project. That's what I would like it to be. If I divide that by 96, because that's how much I have here, I end up with a factor of 12.5. So I need to make this sample, or the size of this sample at any rate, 12.5 times for my whole blanket. And I already found out that this sample weighs 47 grams. So I can multiply this by 47 grams, and I know that I need at least 587.5 grams. So I would round it up probably and make sure that I have 600 grams to make this project. So by doing a gauge swatch, I will know right off the bat if I'm going to have enough yarn to see it through. I'm sure somebody out there was wondering, what if you used more than one color in your swatch? In that case, you would have to think ahead and you would have to weigh your skeins before making the swatch and then weigh them again afterwards. And then you'll know, for example, in this case, how much green you used in this swatch. If you're using a pattern, you can use the swatch to make sure that your yarn, hook size, and technique meet the specifications of the pattern so that the project will end up the correct shape and size. How much of a problem will it be if you don't meet the gauge? Well, it depends on the project. You might not care if your baby blanket or scarf comes out slightly smaller or larger than it should, but at least you'll know what to expect if you've done the swatching. For example, if I find out that my baby blanket here is going to come out slightly smaller than what the pattern calls for, I could add extra stitches, keeping in mind the stitch repeat to make it as wide as I want it to be, using the calculation I showed you earlier. Or I could add a border, for example. And again, I would need to count for that when I am planning for the amount of yarn to use. For a fitted garment, not having the proper gauge can mean spending a lot of hours on a piece of clothing that doesn't fit. So, how do you adjust the gauge? The most obvious answer is to change your hook size. So if you have too many stitches in your 4-inch swatch, so if I have 16 and I'm only supposed to have 13, I would go up a size or 2 with my hook. So instead of using a 5mm, I would use a 6mm, for example, and I would try it again. Conversely, if your stitch count is too low, it's only 16 and it's supposed to be 20, I want my stitches to be a little bit smaller, so I'd go down in hook size. The second issue you might be having is with your yarn. A number 4 yarn in one type, or number 3 yarn, whatever, could be slightly thinner than another yarn of the same number. Now make sure you're comparing apples to apples, in this case acrylic to acrylic. So this number 4 yarn has 180 meters in 100 grams. This number 4 yarn has, where's my number? 182 meters in 100 grams. So this one's slightly longer, meaning it's going to be slightly thinner. And that's a very small discrepancy in this case, but you'll find that some yarns can be quite different, quite a bit thinner, even though the number on the label is what the pattern is calling for. So double check. Maybe your yarn that you want to use is not the same as what the pattern's calling for, and it's actually a little thicker or thinner, and then you can make adjustments. Do you need to switch to another yarn? Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe you can just add a few stitches or change up your design based on what you have found out from your swatch. The trickiest gauge problem to solve occurs when your width measurement is correct, but the row count is not. Let me show you what I mean with this little double crochet sample. If I find that my number of stitches is correct, but my number of rows is too big or too small, meaning that my stitches are too short or too tall, changing up my hook size is not going to fix that because my piece will become both wider and taller, and I still won't have the right ratio between the two. So if you run into that problem before, you know how frustrating it can be. And it comes down to your technique, so you have to pay attention to how you're forming your stitches to solve this problem. I should back up for a bit. If you find that you don't have the right height for your rows, it's not always going to matter, right? In an Afghan or something, just add a few more rows. It doesn't matter. But if you are making a fitted garment, for example, a sweater with a shaped collar and sleeve openings, the number of rows being off can affect the shaping of your garment, so you may need to make an adjustment. When I make my double crochet stitch, you'll notice that I insert my hook, I pick up the yarn, and then I yarn over again and pull through, and this first loop I keep fairly small, fairly close to the work. Okay, I simply pick it up, and right away I go back, yarn over, and pull my loop through. So that makes a fairly tight first step in the stitch, and it keeps my stitches fairly short. But if I were to lengthen out that first loop by holding my crochet hook more straight across, see how the line of the crochet hook goes in line with the stitches? Before it was pointed down like this. That's how I typically would do it. But if I pull that first stitch a little straighter so that my hook is more in line with the work, more straight across, and then I form my stitch, that is going to make a taller stitch. It's that first leg that determines how tall your stitch is going to be. So if I pull that first yarn over through a little bit more and make a first loop that's bigger, it is going to make stitches that are visibly taller. See how much taller those ones are than these ones? So simply in the way that I'm holding my hook, my stitches are larger in these last few than they were over here. So if you find that you need to make your stitches taller, look at how you are holding your hook and how tall that first pull through is when you're forming your stitch. You may need to make an adjustment in how you work the stitch in order to get a taller or shorter row of stitches. And that will affect your overall gauge in the height. So I hope that these little tips have helped you to understand why you should make a gauge swatch and all the important information you can get from your gauge swatch. If you found this helpful at all, I'd really appreciate it if you'd drop me a comment and if you would consider subscribing. It really helps me to continue making videos if I hear from you, and also I'd love to hear what other problems you might have with crocheting that I could help you to solve in a video. Thanks so much for joining me, and have a super day.